Welcome everybody to another meeting of the Books That Move Us book club with Sarasota Orchestra staff and musicians. Today we're going to be talking about Musicophilia, Tales of Music and the Brain by the celebrated and legendary neurologist Oliver Sacks. Our cellist Cheeko Matsusaka brought this book to the table, and we're really looking forward to discussing it with you guys. My name is Sara Stovall. I'm the Communications Manager for the orchestra, and I just want to introduce a few tips on how to participate in this conversation. If you're joining us on Zoom, we have the chat feature and the Q&A for you guys to submit your questions and discussion topics. And if you're watching later on Facebook, we encourage you to use the comment section there to keep the conversation going about this fascinating book. So I want to introduce our panel of musicians today. Again, we have Cheeko Matsusaka. She's a member of our cello section. And again, she selected this book for our book club. We also are joined by William Johnston. He's a violist with the orchestra, and Laura Stephenson Petty, who is a clarinetist. She plays clarinet with the orchestra. One thing that we always do typically to start out the book club is we start out with a little icebreaker question. And with this one, with this book, since he talked at length, a whole section of the book is about musical imagery and earworms in particular. We thought we'd go around and share what earworm do we have stuck in our head this morning? Cheeko, I'll let you start.
Okay, this morning it's actually Under Day, Rise Up. Someone had posted it on Facebook and I can't get it out of my head.
Yeah.
But yesterday it was Baby Beluga. So there you go.
Nice. What about you, Laura? You got anything playing on loop in your mind this morning?
I do not often wake up with any type of earworms. The only time I have earworms is after I've played something, and it'll kind of be in my mind for a while. But when I wake up, I don't really have something sort of gnawing at me. My house is really quiet and my mind is really quiet when I wake up. So I don't really have anything running through my head right now.
That sounds kind of lucky for some.
Well, you would think playing music your entire life that you would have this continual record player. But I definitely have the ability to turn it on and off most of the time.
Right on. Bill, do you have an earworm that's either plaguing or delighting you today?
Yeah, well, unlike Laura, I'm very susceptible to them, and so the past couple of months, I've gotten in the habit of doing yoga with Adrienne videos on YouTube in the morning, and she's got this little intro music jingle and exit music. It's like a slide guitar type thing because she's from Texas, and it's got so I just did that a few minutes ago, so that's what I'm hearing right now.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like my earworm because it's I've got a medley of like folk and country music going on in my head this morning, just switching back and forth between Old Crow Medicine Show and John Prine and a little bit of Trampled by Turtles. I think that's probably because I played a concert yesterday with my folk band, so that's probably why they're swirling around. Oh, wow. Pam, I have in the comments here in the chat section, Pam Fent, she's got Estes Tone, Internal Flight is her earworm of the day. She says it's an hour long, but it is in her head a lot. I hope that sounds soothing and meditative. So I hope that's a positive earworm. So Cheeko, would you tell us about this book, how it got on your shelf, and its importance to you in your life?
I chose this book. I mean, there's a reason why I chose it back in early 2000. I had heard about Oliver Sacks after he had done an interview on 60 Minutes in 1995. And he was showing these clips of physical therapy sessions that he was having with patients, or he was observing them. And these were being done in tandem with a music therapist. And the music therapist was at the keyboard, and he was showing Morley Safer that these Parkinson's patients that could not walk by themselves, that they either needed assistance or a walker, but all of a sudden, now that they were being accompanied by the steady playing of a piano, they were able to walk independently. They were finding a freedom of movement that basically Parkinson's had taken from them. And to me, that spoke. And just the fact that this man was speaking in very practical and grounded terms, it was something that was finally lighting my way to try and understand. I think a lot of musicians go through this phase that we're always chasing after this idea that music has some magical power to restore the human soul, and so we're always, because of the way we're educated and sort of insulated, we never learn how to ask, why is this happening? And for Oliver Sacks to be so staid and just so quintessentially British, he was a very rational man, and he was saying, yes, it is magic system, but he would explain the how. How is this happening? Why is this happening? And 10 years after I saw that, or actually 20 years, I hate to say it, 20 years after I saw that interview, I was beginning my certification to become a music practitioner. And of course, my reasons for choosing the book was very utilitarian, because I wanted him to show me his case studies, show me, the science behind this. Why is this happening? How is it happening? And sort of give me the information I need to state my case in very clinical terms. But I came back to this book, especially for this reading list, because what I loved and fell in love with Oliver Sacks in general was this very empathetic approach, that he is very staid, but sort of the trauma of the way he grew up. I mean, he grew up during that generation of young people that had to be removed from their families during World War II for their own safety. His parents had to stay in in London, while the children were sent to the countryside. And that separation was traumatic for him and also for his brother. And living with that, having to go to a new place, going to a new school, being bullied at school, and then watching the onset of his brother's schizophrenia, also being a gay man in his young adulthood, being a gay man in England, where it was still considered essentially illegal,
Yeah.
and running to the United States to somehow create a life for himself. I mean, it was chaos. And even these teachers who said, Oliver is brilliant, but I'd be surprised if he'd amount to anything, because he's a hot mess. And pretty much his first early years in internships in California, and even when he tried to switch over to research in neurology, it's just like, you need to get your life together. You really do. And thankfully he was able to, because what came out of that, as one publisher said, was an unparalleled writer and physician who could be three things. He could be the patient, he could be the doctor observing, but then and then as the storyteller, he was being himself. And so I think the way he tells or shares the case studies of his patients, it's really, it is unparalleled. He's just amazing in these stories. And so rereading this again for, this reading list. It's just a wonderful reintroduction to empathy, and which is, I think, something that we have to embrace right now,
Absolutely.
following the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, but it's something to hang on to and learn from. So
Yeah.
that's why.
Yes, I was really struck in this book too, how, yes, he brought so much of himself into, he was his own case study in a lot of ways. And he shared so much from his life with that, his story about having that terrifying accident when he was mountain climbing, I believe it was, or hiking.
Right.
Yes, and he had to use, we were talking about musical imagery. He basically kind of used a row your boat, the earworm, to help him propel himself with I think it was a detached quadricep muscle back down the mountain and become rescued. I mean, and then, everything that happened to him with, I think it was Mendelssohn's violin concerto in the hospital, how that, became kind of a solace for him. I don't know. It seemed like it kept him sane in a way while he was immobilized. And but yes, he is such a remarkable storyteller, and does bring so much empathy to these stories about some just wild, almost unfathomable things that can happen in the brain. But I, as kind of a layman, I'm really interested in hearing from you all, professional musicians who spend so much of your lives immersed in music, about your reading and reaction to some of the things in this book. In particular, we've been talking a bit about musical imagery and different kinds of it. In the book, it seems to be, he talks about whether you just kind of hear things in your head, kind of almost voluntarily, but for some people it becomes, almost a torment. I think he called it haunted by music, where you're hallucinating music. It's as if you can, it's happening outside of your head, but it's not. But going back to that first one, he talks a lot about mental rehearsal of music, and I would love to. How does mental rehearsal factor into your daily lives as musicians? Laura, how about I'll invite you to go first.
Hi, everyone.
Hey.
I have so much to say about this book, but I will try to talk about musical imagery. Mental practice plays a huge role in my preparation for anything I do. I don't know if it's because I am now a seasoned veteran that it doesn't take as much energy and thought to execute a lot of the things. And I don't know if it's a surprise to our audience, but a lot of the music that we play is not difficult in a sense of executing it as much as difficult in the sense of playing as an ensemble, playing in tune, sort of those things. So it's not that I need to spend a lot of time physically playing a lot of my music. Now, practicing to technique is a different thing, but I can get pretty much all of the process done without even touching my instrument to prepare for a lot of things by mental preparation. I can tell what notes I'm going to miss. So I go through my music and I actually mark the things I know I'll miss before I've missed them. Before I have even practiced it, I know I would miss that F sharp. My eyes would not get there, and I'll mark it, and then I won't miss it because I've actually practiced it without practicing it. So it's super effective. I've tried to get my students to do it. I think it's a little harder for them to, I think it that I've played for a while, and that the sort of pre-planned bit of playing is so ingrained, helps me. But I think it's helpful for everyone. I think if you just look at it, you get a lot of information.
Yeah, Bill, what about you? How does musical imagery and mental rehearsal feature into your life?
Yeah, I would say, well, like Laura, it's become a bigger part of what I do. I mean, none of us are exactly new to the orchestra, right? I think this is my 17th season now. Um, but I think as it's one of those things as you get older and, as our bodies age, it becomes, excuse me, becomes more important to find ways of practicing that don't involve so much physical work. And I got, I got I subscribed to a blog, a monthly blog newsletter from Arnold Steinhardt, the first violinist of the former Guarneri Quartet, and I, one of his recent ones he wrote a couple of months ago was about uh, mental practice, and he talked about the same thing, how as the older he got, and he struggled with some injuries in his own playing uh, when he was younger, and the less and less time he needed to spend with the instrument because he was able to do more of it from looking at scores, listening to recordings. And if you think about it, I think conductors are like the ultimate mental practicers, right? Because uh, they have to have such a detailed vision of the music that the orchestra is going to play in order to communicate that to all of us. So I think I think the more, even as a non-conductor, as an instrumentalist, the more we can do that, um, it's both good for us physically, but also it's good for our performance to have a more, just the very much more clearer vision of what you want to do, and then your body is able to respond to that more easily because there's less confusion of what you want to do. You have a really good sense of it. So I think that's an important aspect of mental rehearsal as well.
Yeah. Cheeko, is there anything you wanted to add about musical imagery and rehearsal and as it related to the book?
Um, I can recall that Oliver Sacks mentioned that his father had carried around like pocket scores of symphonies, and he was able to hear them in his head. And Sacks himself said, I was not musically talented enough to be able to do that. I'm there too. I can't. And so, strangely enough, I sort of come at it backwards, that when I practice, I close my eyes
Mm.
because somehow doing that gives me the purest sense of what I need to do. Whereas if I look at the page, there's all this baggage that comes with it. You know, Laura
Right.
mentions that I see that F sharp, I know I'm going to miss it. And it's just like I look at a bunch of 16th notes and I say, I can't play this. So I close my eyes with
Mhm.
what I do. And I'm able to perceive actually what's happening better than if I were to have my eyes open.
Interesting, because the minute I open my eyes, or the minute I close my eyes, is the minute the music stops.
So everybody's different. I think,
I'll be
but
like,
yeah,
I don't know what I'm playing right now. I have no idea. But stringed instruments learn so much differently. In the book talks about a lot of development of things when you're really young. You don't remember. And stringed instruments often start much younger. Woodwind instruments start much later. And so I think the way we learn music and the way we remember it and how internalized it is as an abstract thing. So I think string players have a more of a feel for what they're doing.
we tend to, because I don't know, Bill, if you started out this way, but we start out with Suzuki, and that's total reliance on the ears. So for some reason, I relate, or the way my brain works is if I close my eyes, I'm able to hear better. And even when I do anything, when I do Tai Chi, if I close my eyes, I know better how my muscles are supposed to move. So
I do that in yoga, but that's about it. I think it's because I don't want to see everything.
I get that. Yeah.
Especially, I just don't want to. But Yeah, it's interesting. It would be interesting. He didn't, go into that in the book, but the different ways
Mhm.
we learn. But anyway,
Yeah, I have
I,
to wonder. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
no, I was just gonna say I'm kind of with Laura in that in terms of closing my eyes. Actually find it more difficult because I just find it harder to keep my balance when my eyes are closed, But when yeah, I think just going back to the idea of like what you started on. So I didn't start on the violin or viola. I started on the piano, and then I was much older when I started playing a string instrument. But um, I don't know, and maybe Laura, with you and some of your wind colleagues who, if they started on another instrument, as a very youngster, and then switched, whether that's a kind of a different, you get the experience of having just music, and then when you go to the instrument that you end up playing, it's like you have a sense of music before you actually have a sense of the instrument. So
but I do think it's my parents, talked about maybe people who were not fans of music and various reasons. But if you're not exposed to a lot of music when you're young, sort of talking about households that maybe didn't have music going on. In my household, there was always music, classical music, Bruckner, constantly Bruckner. I haven't played a Brook. Nobody wants to play Bruckner, but when I hear Bruckner, it's like some kind of like youth. Um, so I do think that if you played a piano or played an instrument, no matter what it was, all of that translates. It's just the whole concept of music and just learning it. And so I think is really important. Even I'm sure I heard music in the womb, just the constant classical music from very conception. I think, and that can be, wind players. I think a lot of them play another instrument, and I think it's just the concept of music, whatever instrument you're playing. I don't necessarily think it's germinal to the nature of the instrument. I did not play anything before I started clarinet. I begged for piano lessons. My parents were not about to spend $500 on a piano, and I don't know where they could get a $500 piano, but that was too much. So I begged and no piano. So I only had oral music. I wasn't able to play an instrument till the clarinet. But I'm sure if I had been able to, it would have been very advantageous, I think.
Laura, I want to give you a chance to share something about the book that either kind of like opened your eyes or made you like think, tell us something from the book that's really stuck with you.
Oh gosh.
If you can pick just one.
Well, what Cheeko said in the opening, that I've spent my life, I'm intensely affected by music. I will cry playing certain pieces while I'm playing the clarinet, and clarinet is where you breathe out. And it doesn't help if you're like, yeah, it doesn't work out. So when we play Enigma Variations, some of those really get me. And when Anu conducted, I had trouble. I have trouble in some Mahler. I've literally, so, and like Cheeko said, we're brought up and we practice this, but we don't know why we're affected. Like what is going on, and why am I so affected, and why are people so affected by music? Why is it in every single culture? If you ask anyone what their favorite, no matter what genre of music, they have very strong feelings usually. And it was just so fascinating to read about why that is by reading about the absence of it in people. The only way they can kind of research it, if everyone has it, you can't really, but the absence of it leaves that kind of ability to say, okay, what is going on here that this is not there? I also was really interested in the role of rhythm, and how it's so elemental. And we think of rhythm when we're teaching, oh, that's a quarter note that takes twice as long as an eighth note, kind of relating it just to time. But it is um, an elementary thing that helps you in a lot of ways that are not musical. The Parkinson's people just having something to initiate the movement. And the reason he used the Mendelssohn violin concerto in order to learn to walk, because the rhythm of walking at the tempo of that piece helped him. And I thought that was just fascinating. And I actually, just before ending, I could talk all day, of course. And if anybody knows me out there, I think they know that's true. I had a student, and I've had one student like this, that had a complete lack of rhythm that I've never seen anything like it. And so I was reading the book, and I was constantly thinking of this kid. He couldn't clap. He couldn't verbalize. Like, it was really lacking completely. And I started thinking, I didn't know how to teach him. It was a disability. I mean, he really couldn't connect those things. And I struggled, and I taught him for 5 years. He was not very good, and he just kept playing, and I just don't even know why. But as I was reading the book, I was like trying to figure out if he had any of these, how this connected to him in particular. So anyway, that's part of, I found it fascinating in every way.
Yeah. Well, it did seem like there are benefits to music, even from people, or music seemed to kind of like seep into the brain, even for people who weren't perceiving music as music. I thought that was just so fascinating, when Oliver Sacks talked to people with amusia, who, it was like a late onset amusia, and they would be playing something from that was a beloved piece from their past. And he says, do you know what this is? And they would say, no, but it reminds me of that piece that I used to love. So it's amazing how, music, it has so many, it's so rich with information, but it's rich with information that we don't know quite how to describe. Like it kind of evades language, which is one of our primary ways of disseminating information. So it kind of makes sense to me how music seems to be like so kind of infectious in a way. It is able to work on our brains in ways that in deeper ways and more complex ways than just the cortex up here, the more evolved parts of our brain that we think we're using for processing and sharing information.
It's very, very very deep in the subconscious, some of this stuff. And that means, as your brain function, your higher brain function, more subconscious, then you've got your vegetative state kind of things, and some of this what is it, basal ganglia stuff, this deep in the brain, that is not something you can, I think I'm going to look in my basal ganglia today, see what's going on. Like that these things that make up music are so deep in our consciousness and deep in our functionality. Is and unraveling that. It's one thing to kind of know, oh, I walk better to Rihanna than is one thing, but like, why does rhythm help Parkinson's patients? Why is music open up people who are unable to access these things without music? And so it's fascinating how deep music goes. It's not just, oh, I like that, or I like listening to that, or that's fun. It is deep in our functionality and our ability to exist.
Yeah.
Laura,
One of
going back
his,
to your, oh, sorry, Cheeko, you can go ahead.
that's okay.
Laura,
Sorry, I just wanted,
yeah.
I I just wanted to ride on to what Laura was saying. What the idea, one of his correspondents described that music was like architecture to him, that he was one of these amusia, and he just was able to convey, and Sachs was able to go upon, was that it provides a structure. When, as you, Laura, had said, that in the absence of a certain skill set, that music had provided the structure in order for flow to happen, because music flows because of rhythm, because of harmony, because of cadence. So that's why, at least in his perspective, one of the reasons why music did help a lot of these people find movement. Okay, now to Bill. Sorry.
No, Laura, I was going to say that, you know, I think we've all had students like yours at some point who we felt like, you know, I mean, I teach. We've all had students who feel like, well, gosh, this kid's never going to get it. But there's like, I mean, he was coming back for 5 years, you know, and it's like, there must be something that he was getting out of lessons, even if it doesn't seem like he's improving. And I think this book was inspiring in a lot of ways to me as a teacher, just in terms of the sheer number of ways he showed that music can access parts of people's minds that they didn't have access to before, and just the effects that can have, like the benefit that can have for people. And I think really, even as a teacher, not a clinician, but just as a music teacher, um, like we really have to search for ways to get inside people's minds. Um, I think about a student I worked with when I was a grad student. I tutored music theory and ear training, and one of the kids I had was a very good trombonist, but he was failing his theory and ear training classes, and his problem was he couldn't figure out, when he was doing dictation, so the teacher plays a melody and he has to write it down. He sometimes couldn't tell if the note was going up or down, and it was a really baffling problem. And I think what ended up helping him to pass eventually was, you know, just we had to find other ways of internalizing it. So like he had to, um, you know, it wasn't it wasn't just enough to try to listen to it, but he had to try to replicate it. And he was able to sing back what he was hearing, and then find a way to translate that. So just there was some sort of neural pathway that wasn't quite working, but he found a way around it, which was, and I think that was a good lesson to me, at least in the early years of my teaching.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest, like, I think overarching concepts about this book that stood out to me, is this concept of plasticity, and that music just it can work in so many different ways in the brain, and even as to like help the brains overcome, you know, damage or losing access to different parts of the brain. And I was so inspired by these stories of you know, composers and musicians who, you know, maybe suffered an accident or you know, some kind of condition where they, you know, lost parts of their music, but over time and with persistence they were able to recover. And it was just, you know, there were so many, you know, so many kind of scary stories, but you know, at the end, you know, they were they were finding their, through music, through the influence of music and the ways that, you know, that music gets in there and activates different parts of our brain, they are able to start, you know, getting back to some of those things, or even access new outlets of creativity. But and Laura, going back to something you said about rhythm, but another thing that just kind of lit me up about the book was the stories about people who kind of heard music in their own, like if they had hearing loss or amusia or of some kind, but particularly I think it was people with hearing loss. They started to hear music coming out of like their heartbeats or their breath, almost like these internal, these internal rhythms. And I just thought that was so beautiful that our brains can be attuned to making music out of things that aren't musical. It is just another example of how music seems to be just so tenacious and infectious with us. Oh, Laura, you unmute yourself there.
Sorry. That's interesting because as I was reading sort of the cochlear, ear hair cells and stuff, and I have known people that have had this happen where the pitch in certain ranges starts to distort. So, and it has been when sometimes when they're sick, something goes on, or and I knew a violinist who just suddenly was playing a half step sharp for everything. Like he couldn't reconcile what he was knew to be the note and he had perfect pitch and what the actual note was. And this person was a really well-known violinist. So I thought that was pretty interesting when they had these. It wasn't hearing, it was related to hearing loss in a way, but it was also this distortion. And again, the book was interesting because it examined a lot of pathologies as opposed to talking about what we all experience. It was just a glimpse of when something went wrong, and then you acknowledge, oh, well, I'm so glad everything's working right, kind of thing. Like you don't know what you have until it's gone. And reading this book is like, a lot of things to leave, which is terrifying in one way, but you have to kind of like realize this is a lifetime of stories. And
sure.
I thought so. From what you said, Sarah, I was just thinking of the distortions of the hearing loss, which really wasn't anything to do with what you were saying about the nice peaceful heartbeat rhythm, but it just made me think.
Well, I'm curious if you guys, since these are, these were largely, descriptions of, pathologies, things seeming to go wrong in the brain. But, I do think that there is something to this book that illuminates kind of the human condition for us all. And do you guys have any thoughts on, what did you take away from it that, that applies more universally to musical experience outside of these really interesting conditions that Oliver Sacks observed in patients and in himself sometimes.
I think for me, it was this concept of the ubiquitous, I think the term that he used, the ubiquitous of music, that it is everywhere, and that sometimes we just don't realize how pervasive it is, and therefore we don't fully appreciate how it brings people together. And some of the most moving stories are like about Clive, who had the tremendous dramatic memory amnesia. He could only, remember 2 or 3 seconds at a time. But when they put him in front of the organ, which was his instrument, sorry, that sounds slightly gross, but his keyboard, okay, he was able to become himself for that moment and remember and recall all of that. And it connected him to all his old friends who he had been isolated from. And for the Alzheimer's patient, Harry S., who was the baritone, and when he was singing his family, his wife, his daughter. He was the dad, he was the husband, he was himself, and sort of all of that feeling of isolation and sort of, I'm a patient, I'm not myself, that all was erased by having these musical parts of the brain still intact, and that people could be, they could return back to themselves, or as one commentator said, that Oliver Sacks had this way of bringing the narrative back to the patient became whole. And I think that's one of the things I just love about him, is that we become ourselves.
That's beautiful, Cheeko. Anybody else have anything they wanted to share about on kind of, yeah.
What I took away was, a lot of times as a musician, you're really preoccupied with your own performance of something and the quality of it. And with your students, you're worried about the quality of what they're doing. But really, every single person who ever hears you is benefiting in their own individual way. And you never know what that is. You never know, like maybe someone, a lot of these people weren't musical, but we're getting so much out of music that you don't have to be musical in return to love music, and and that every audience member that we play for doesn't care if I feel like I'm extra sharp on that note or I'm unhappy with that note. It plays a much more important role in their life, and you just never know what that is. And every single person who you play for has an individual need being filled by what you're doing. And I think it helps musicians can be kind of not selfish, but you spend your whole day, how was my playing? What am I doing? You're in your practice room by yourself. It's very, very me.
Yeah,
And
it's self-absorbed. I don't know. That's not a positive way to say it either, but
analyzing what you're doing and
yes.
trying to make it better. You're not, saving children. And so it's nice to step away and realize that people need this, and they need it in their own way. So I that's what I took away from.
Yes, I shouldn't say self-absorbed. I should say very individualized.
Well, it's hard to name. It is just self-centered in a way, but not in a negative way. But you are thinking about what you're doing more than thinking about how it relates to anybody else, because you're trying to make a product. And so I find that thinking about the effect it might have on who you're playing for helps get out of that a little bit.
Yeah. Bill?
Yeah, just sort of echo what Laura was saying. I think when we're professional musicians, we spend a lot of our time with other professional musicians, and we all operate with certain assumptions about music, and just in terms of how our colleagues hear us and how we hear each other, and just how we understand what's happening. And we all come together and we play, and we put our sound out from the Van Wezel stage, and there are 1,700 other people out there listening to us, and they may be having such different experiences from what we are experiencing. And you hear that from talking to patrons after a concert. You think about how something went, and they come up and tell you something about the performance that was like, really, like, wow, okay, great. But we it just I think the book is inspiring in that way, in terms of even beyond like thinking about the audiences that we can reach, who can actually come to a concert. Like, there are so many ways that music reaches people and into their minds, and that that there's just really a great it's just an amazing thing, the way music interacts with our minds, that that it's mind opening, I think, to read this book and to think about these things.
Absolutely. Well, I would like to take a moment to talk about what's coming up next on our in our Books of Note and the Books That Move Us program. Let me get that. So we have 2 podcast episodes. Part of Books of Note is this the Classical Music in America podcast that's hosted by our artistic advisor, Jeffrey Kahane, and our director of artistic planning, Carrie Smith. And we have actually 2 episodes of that podcast coming out later in March. On March 2nd, we have they'll be talking about 2 different biographies about Dvorak. So if you're a Dvorak fan, definitely tune into that podcast. And then on Tuesday, March 16th, they'll be discussing this newer book by Alex Ross, Wagnerism, and you know the popularity of Wagner's music and how he's something of a controversial figure, and a look at his that aspect of music history and its relevance and his impact on music today. The Books That Move Us book club will be back on April 5th, and we'll be diving into Evenings with the Orchestra by the French composer Hector Berlioz. And that was selected by a member of our violin section, Roxanne Frangi-Soloway. She's going to be leading that discussion. And I also want to take this moment to thank the sponsor of the Books of Note program. That's the Gulf Coast Community Foundation. So thank you to them for making this great series possible, and for helping Sarasota Orchestra stay connected to all of you outside the concert hall in this really fun and engaging way. So with that, I want to thank you, Cheeko, for bringing this amazing, fascinating book to our book club. Thank you, Bill and Laura, for sharing your thoughts on it today. And thank you to all of you for being here and for tuning in. And we'll see you at the next book club meeting. Y'all take care.